Okay, welcome everyone to the latest episode of Headlines and History. I think we're on episode 18 at this point, and this would be the part 2 of our Iraq series. But the interesting thing about today is that it is the first time I'm going to video record the podcast. I knew that when I started this thing multiple episodes ago, back in March of 2024, that I eventually wanted to get to a point where I could video the episode and potentially use some of the clips and stuff for social media to push the podcast out a little bit further. And I think we've come to that point today. So bear with me here. It's going to be a little amateurish, possibly, but better than just having a little logo, I guess, on top of the podcast when we put it out there in video form. So it'll be the same on audio on Podbean, where I've been posting ever since, but you'll have a video background and a video option, I should say, on YouTube, if you will. So, okay, now that we've got that out of the way, listen, episode 18, part 2 of the Iraq story. What we talked about last week was how this thing began for me, how it is that I got into the Army National Guard, why it is that I joined the Army National Guard, and then what led to the possibility that we as a unit in the 42nd Infantry Division, how I would even be in Iraq. And we talked about how, what the atmosphere, the geopolitical atmosphere was at the time during the 90s, the late 90s when I joined in 1997 in particular, or specifically, and why a National Guard unit would end up in Iraq anyways. And so what I want to do in the beginning of this episode, before we transition to part 2, and part 2 for me would be when we ended up leaving my home station in the Capital District area and ended up in Fort Drum for, it was 8 months at that point, beginning in May of 2004, all the way until January of 2005, believe it or not. And but I wanted to recap a little bit about why it is we were even in Iraq in the first place. It was, to this day, it's still a confusing topic that isn't necessarily doesn't have a universal explanation. It isn't something that everyone agrees upon as to what the purpose is for us to go and why we were there when the Taliban was harboring Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden in 2001 after 9/11, but we ended up in Iraq in March of 2003. All right, so there are multiple explanations, and some of which you can accept or you can deny or whatever you'd like. But I'm just going to give you a few of mine and how I understand the scenario, and from a historical perspective, and then. And based on my experience. The one most common explanation that everybody talks about is that President Bush and his team, after 9/11 in particular, but prior to 2003 and the initial invasion, was that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And Colin Powell had even testified to that fact in front of the UN and made the claim that Saddam Hussein was in possession of weapons of mass destruction in some form or fashion. Nobody made the claim that he had nuclear weapons by any means, but chemical, biological, and he had shown a propensity to use that in the past anyways. He had gassed his own people in 1998, the most well-known, when he killed about 5,000 Kurds in Halabja in 1998. Prior to Desert Storm in 1990 or Desert Shield in 90 and Desert Storm in 91. But, the narrative goes that it wasn't necessarily the case. And when the United States and Britain and our allies entered Iraq in 2003, that we were unable to locate any weapons of mass destruction, and then therefore the president lied. And the one thing that I want to make sure I get out of the way in the beginning is that just because there weren't weapons of mass destruction didn't mean that the president and his staff lied. All right. If you dig into the details, what you'll come to find is that they did draw a conclusion based on a single human source, a source that they did trust, and that's their prerogative, a source that they did trust that actually came from Britain, that said the that Saddam Hussein was in possession of some form or fashion of weapons of mass destruction. Again, chemical or biological at least. And so it wasn't as if the administration, the Bush administration at this time, made it up out of whole cloth. Now, we can have the argument as to whether the Bush administration assessed that intelligence properly. We can talk about whether the Bush administration was amped to go to Iraq and they had other motives and they were just they were using confirmation bias and they were trying to find data and intelligence that would have pushed them, given them the reason to go into Iraq in 2003. That's a different conversation. But to say that the president lied, in my opinion, I just don't think that's true. I think he may have been misguided. I think he may have been a little bit overly motivated to go into Iraq in 2003, but I don't think that he, again, lied out of whole cloth. I don't think he had a conversation with Colin Powell and the rest of his staff and said, listen, we have no evidence for this, but I'm just going to go out there and make the claim that I do, right? I don't think that's the case. So lying, I think, is unfair. Misleading, potentially. And again, we can have that conversation. But one thing that we need to make clear when having this discussion about whether we should have gone or whether we shouldn't is to acknowledge the fact that Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. Okay? He was an animal. He really, really was. He was deluded. He was a narcissist. He was a murderous thug who abused not only his own people, but invaded multiple countries within the 10 years that he had in the first 10 years of his presidency. He started as the vice president in prior to 1979. 79 is when he became the president of Iraq. He pushed out the president at the time, basically by saying, if you don't leave, I'm going to kill you. And within the first year, he invaded Iran. On a pretense that he wanted to have more power within the Middle East. He was very pro-Sunni and Arab, which is what he is. And Iran is Shia Persian, very different. And if you look at Saddam's history and how he views the Arab people throughout history, he views them as better people than the Persians. And then we all know the story about 1990 when he invaded Kuwait to steal as much oil as he possibly could, making things up that Kuwait had slanted oil drills that went underneath the border between Iraq and Kuwait. And then he wanted to subsume Kuwait and make it the 19th province, something that he felt was owed to him. This is all within the first 10 years. He hated the Shia, which was the majority of the individuals, the majority of the religious folks that lived in Iraq. The Sunnis were the minority. And he hated, even worse, he hated the Kurds, which make up about 15 to 20% of the country, who live in the north, who completely separate themselves from Baghdad and the rule from Baghdad. And again, as I had mentioned in earlier, he even gassed 5,000 of them in Halabja in 1998, women and children. He had two sons, Uday and Qusay, if you recall, that were even worse animals than he was. These are two guys who were known to approach weddings and quite literally rape the bride prior to the wedding ceremony taking place. Right in the ceremony. Vicious people. And so he being Saddam was a complete menace, again, to his own people and to the people in the region. And there's one thing that we need to acknowledge as well, is that if you're one of those that brings up the point, well, okay, great, Saddam's a bad guy, but there are a lot of bad guys throughout the world, and the United States doesn't seem to necessarily care, the United States and its allies doesn't necessarily seem to care about the rest of the bad guys in the world. They just kind of pick and choose which bad guys they want to deal with, and it's usually the ones that have some direct relation to interests of the United States. Well, my answer would be yes. What else do you expect? The United States has definitely assumed a security responsibility post World War II, whether we want to admit it or whether we like that fact or not in 2024. It doesn't matter. It is true. So the United States assumed responsibility after World War II to maintain a global security posture where there was relevant peace and people could trade and make money and hopefully avoid some type of world war like we had, the two of them that we had in the first half of the 20th century. And so, yes, the United States and its allies have made decisions to remove people diplomatically in the beginning, if we can, forcefully. Hopefully we don't have to do that, but sometimes forcefully, that are running havoc, reaping havoc, again, on their own people and against countries and people that are outside of their borders, potentially even globally. And so, yes, sometimes you have to make a choice. And it just so happens that Saddam Hussein sat on top of some of the largest oil reserves in the entire world. And it just so happens that the entire world runs on oil in that time, in that time in our history. So, yeah, it only makes sense that Saddam Hussein would find himself on a higher priority of individuals that the U.S. and, again, its allies, the West, they really don't want running around in power because they can cause such damage globally. We saw what happens with the oil embargoes in the 70s, how much money countries lost, how much money Americans were having to pay for gas. Who wants that? And so, yeah, Saddam Hussein found himself on a higher priority list. And what I hate discussing with people is saying, well, but because we didn't go into Chad, right, and remove the leader of that country who was a bad guy and was torturing his own people, and it's causing havoc in Central Africa, then we should have just left Saddam Hussein alone. No, that's poor logic as well. Okay, you don't, in the world of geopolitics, you don't have to have just black and white, right? It's just a fact of the matter that oil runs the world in relative capacity, and that's where Saddam was. So, what I would say is that let's not forget whether we have this long discussion as to whether the intelligence was there to go into Iraq. Let's not ignore the fact that Saddam was a really bad guy. Let's not ignore the fact that it was official U.S. policy since 1998 during the Clinton administration to remove Saddam from power. That was the official policy. Now, it wasn't regime change in the sense that, we were going to use the CIA to go and murder a dictator. That has happened in the past, but that became illegal after the Mossadegh fiasco. That was the most well known, but the Mossadegh fiasco in '53 in Iran. So we don't do that anymore. But it doesn't mean that the United States doesn't involve itself in policies and operations where we try to influence other countries to be peaceful and do the right thing for global stability. And so it was the official policy of the U.S. since 1998, approved by Congress, because he was a bad guy. You're talking about a guy who, and this isn't so well known, you're talking about a guy who created coins with his own face on them, okay? That's not so crazy, right? But created coins with his own face on them, right next to Nebuchadnezzar II, who was the most famous and most widely known, widely effective, you could argue, Babylonian leader from centuries and centuries and centuries ago. And the leader during the time, he was a leader of Babylon at the time, Babylon being where Iraq is, that ended up destroying the temple in Israel. He being Saddam, felt like he was the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar II, and then made coins to demonstrate that fact and handed them out, obviously, within his economy in Iraq. And when I say he was the reincarnation, I don't mean that figuratively. I mean, he literally felt that he was the second coming of Nebuchadnezzar II. He was the chosen man, the chosen Arab Muslim. Nebuchadnezzar, obviously, prior to Islam, but nonetheless from the land of Iraq where Saddam was from. And he felt that he was the literal reincarnation. And so he was just doing and fulfilling what Nebuchadnezzar wasn't able to fulfill when he died. And that was, create this all-powerful country within the Middle East that now Saddam uses. He adds Arabism to that. He adds Arab nationalism, and he adds Islam on top of that. But again, he's just furthering Nebuchadnezzar's work. And so, this is the guy who's controlling Iraq. So let's not just forget the type of behavior that this guy was involved in. Now, as I mentioned in the first episode, all of those things being true, that Saddam was a bad guy, and it was better for the people of Iraq, ultimately better for the Middle East, a more stable region, if Saddam Hussein wasn't running around invading countries and killing his own people. That doesn't necessarily mean that taking Saddam out in 2003, even though the U.S. Congress had said President Bush had the authority, it was official policy since 98, and there were UN resolutions because Saddam wasn't being forthcoming with the IAEA in terms of weapons of mass destruction inspections, that it was legal for this coalition of countries led by the U.S. to go in and take out Saddam. It doesn't mean it was necessarily the smartest thing to do. Why? Well, 9/11, and the military was involved in, the vast majority of the military was involved in Afghanistan in 2001. And, it could have been, there's arguments that the reason, or one of the major factors that Afghanistan turned out the way that it did, eventually us pulling out during the Biden administration a couple years ago, and that pullout being a fiasco, I'll have to admit to that if the United States didn't shift a focus to Iraq in 2003, they may have been able to, they being the lead of the NATO coalition in Afghanistan, may have been able to focus resources, time, and effort on Afghanistan, and maybe we wouldn't have ended up in the same place. Now, again, that's a historical argument. No one has the answer to that. The counter argument being that no one would ever conquer, if you will, or suppress the leadership in Afghanistan at any level because, going all the way back to Alexander, it was nearly impossible. No one's ever done it. And so it doesn't matter. The U.S. and NATO weren't going to be able to do it anyways. But either way, there's a logical argument on both sides there. And I think the longer that time goes on, at least for me, having deployed to Iraq, having spent time there, I was there for 10 months, would have been there a little bit longer if the train up wasn't as long as it was, which we'll talk about. But the longer we get into history here, the more I tend to think that as bad as Saddam was, and as it's easy to lay out the case that he was a bad guy, that the timing probably wasn't great. And the invasion in 2003 really hindered our ability and NATO's ability to handle Afghanistan properly, which was really the justifiable invasion, if you will, post 9/11. And I just happen to think that's probably the case. I think Saddam had to go at some point. I don't know if 1991 was the time. Certainly Dick Cheney didn't think that way. That's one thing that people tend to forget when it comes to the Iraq invasion in 2003, rather, is that, it was Bush and his neocons, to include, Wolfowitz and Cheney and the rest of the team, Condoleezza Rice. That's not necessarily true. If you do the reading, I really do believe that it was Bush and Wolfowitz being the main driver, but it wasn't everybody. Condoleezza Rice wasn't necessarily on board. She understood the moral reason to remove Saddam, as did Colin Powell, but the practical reasons weren't necessarily there. And Cheney wasn't on board initially, and again, because of the practical reasons. He was not on board in 1991 with the first Bush administration, because there were conversations about whether Bush 41, and Norman Schwarzkopf should have led their nearly 500,000 troops all the way to Baghdad and take Saddam out. Again, bad guy. But there were counter arguments like, oh boy, we're really going to get into an insurgency / counterinsurgency here. It could get really messy. We could get bogged down. We could end up being there for 20 years. And so a decision was made not to go to Baghdad and just leave Saddam in power. You can argue whether that's a good idea or not. But my ultimate point here is to say that, there were members in the first Bush administration who were part of the second administration who didn't necessarily think it was a great idea in the beginning. They eventually came around and supported the president, as they should, if they're going to be on the president's team, if they're going to be in his cabinet. If you don't support him, then resign. And they didn't want to resign, so they supported him. And we ended up going. But it may not have been the best time. And to those that make the comment about, a personal connection, I often like to say without evidence, it's not fair to make that kind of a conclusion. But I can see where some would think that way. And I don't think it's because of quote unquote daddy didn't finish the job in Desert Storm. And so Bush 43 had to finish the job. I don't think that's not necessarily the case. If there is a personal connection, I really think it has more to do with the attempted assassination. This, you may not recall, but the Iraqi intelligence services did recruit a bunch of Kuwaitis and others to attempt to assassinate Bush Sr. at the very end of his time in office, and which did lead President Clinton to shoot, I believe it was 23 missiles at the Iraqi intelligence headquarters in Baghdad in response to say, listen, no one is in any position here and will ever be not dealt with if you attempt to assassinate a U.S. president. I don't care which party and who you are. And that was the message that President Clinton sent. And I can see where there would be a personal vendetta in a way. Now, listen, don't get me wrong, okay? I'm not saying that justifies Bush 43 going into Iraq, sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers, ended up losing. I'm not saying any of those things. Okay, I'm not saying that someone trying to kill Bush 41 is justification for Bush 43 going to Baghdad. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that everyone is human at the end of the day, and if Bush 43 did have a personal stake, if you will, and maybe he was making decisions that were emotionally charged, potentially. He wasn't just looking at the scenario in a black and white sense. He's not, say as a Jimmy Carter, right, who has no connection, or, a Gerald Ford has no connection to the Middle East in that way. And like, what would he care one way or the other? He's just looking at it from bad or good. Then yeah, so Bush 43 probably had a little more than that. And he probably had in the back of his mind a little bit of, you tried to kill my dad. Like, again, let's layer that on top of all of the things that make Saddam Hussein a bad guy. Okay. Listen, so we went into Iraq in 2003. Maybe not the best timing. Saddam's a bad guy anyways. And there were plenty of resolutions both in the United States and UN to do it. So, as I said in the first episode, though, because so many soldiers ended up going to Afghanistan, they ended up having to draw from the Guard. So the National Guard got involved, and it just so happened that the 42nd Infantry Division, the unit that I was a member of since 97 when I joined, they ended up getting the call after doing some training for Kosovo and Bosnia in the early 2000s. A shift was made, operational shift was made. The National Guard Bureau decided that the 42nd Infantry Division, the Rainbow, was going to go to Iraq, was going to replace an active duty unit, the 1st ID, 4th ID was there first, 1st ID was there next, and then the 42nd, and we were ultimately replaced by the 101st. And so this is why I end up on the path to go. And so, as I said in the last episode, the 42nd Infantry Division, the headquarters is in the capital region, being Albany, Schenectady, Troy area in New York. And so the closest base that would have, the closest post, army post, that would have the resources in order to prepare a National Guard Division headquarters to go overseas was Fort Drum. It was 3.5 hours drive from the Albany area where the 42nd is, and so that's where we ended up going. And typically, we were only supposed to spend about 4 to 5 months there. That's enough time typically for a division to get ready, to go through all the training, to get all the equipment that they need, to get all their vehicles fixed, all the stuff that you need to get done and to accomplish, and get yourself what we call out the door and overseas and in place to do your thing. But it ended up being that we were there much longer. We ended up getting to Fort Drum in like I said earlier, May of 2004, and we didn't end up leaving until January, just after New Year's Day in 2005. And that's because we accomplished all of our training when we got up there, as the Army had required, but we weren't at 100% strength. So I said in the last episode, not only were we a division headquarters without any down trace units, we didn't have any brigades underneath our command structure. We were waiting to meet those brigades all deployed to Iraq at the same time, and we would meet the commanders overseas. Not only were we waiting for those brigades to be prepared to ship out with us, but we were also waiting for our headquarters to be backfilled by active duty units, because there were only so many soldiers to go around. And so, they asked us to go, Big Army asked us to go, and we went out, we left Troy, left the Albany area with like 75 to 80% strength in the headquarters. We still have 20% of our, what we call IMTO, our UMR, our unit manning roster. We have 20% to fill. We got to get our people to go. We can't go over at 80% strength. So at least that's how the Army wanted it then, and that's typically how it happens. So we completed all of our training at Drum, but we ended up waiting literally, it was over 90 days in order for the Army, Big Army, to backfill our positions with active duty folks. And I remember talking to one of the chief warrant officers who I ended up working with in the intelligence section when I was there, and she was an active duty warrant, and she was talking about what it was like to get the orders to come to the 42nd. And she was getting ready to transition out of her current position, and she called what you call proponent, and proponent was getting ready to send her to her next duty station. And they said, okay, you're going to become part of the division's G2 for the 42nd Infantry Division at Fort Drum. And she was like, what in the hell is the 42nd Infantry Division? There's no 42nd Infantry Division. And proponent was like, oh, no, that's a Guard division. They're going to Iraq, and you have to go with them. And so she PCS'd, like permanent change of station. She, as an active duty soldier, PCS'd to Fort Drum to become part of the 42nd, just as if she was PCSing to go to First ID or some other active duty unit. So there were a lot of active duty soldiers who are like, where am I going? What is the 42nd? Why am I going to... So anyways, we eventually got our backfills from active duty, and we got out the door in January 2005. But I'll tell you, it was a long trip. And what I mean by that is it's throughout the 8 months. It was a journey for our unit, in particular, the 642 MI Battalion, which was the sub-military intelligence battalion underneath the 42nd's division command structure, that to get us ready to go. I remember, we showed up to the armory, and I don't recall the exact day now, but we showed up to the armory to leave. And for weeks, the full-time staff, because in the Guard, there are still full-time staff. I mean, most are 1 week in a month and 2 weeks out of the summer, but there are multiple people who are full-time, because you got to have full-time staff in order to keep an organization like that running. So we had a bunch of mechanics and individuals getting all the trucks ready and getting all of our equipment, because the Army had said, listen, I don't care what you have. I know you've had stuff for decades now, this, Vietnam era cut Vs, which are like pickup trucks and all this stuff that you have, like bring it all up to Fort Drum. We're getting it all ready to go. And we're going to give you some new vehicles. We're going to fix your old vehicles, and we're going to send you overseas. And I remember thinking to myself, even as a young sergeant at the time, thinking like, there's no way these trucks are making it up to Fort Drum. I mean, it's a 3.5, 4 hour car drive in a regular car on a highway at 50, 60 miles an hour, and whatever, 65 miles an hour on the highway. And we're taking these trucks that these mechanics, God bless them, have been working their butt off over the last X amount of weeks to get all of them at 100%. We don't have enough equipment. We didn't have enough stuff to fix them all. and we're going to all put them in this massive convoy, and we're going to get up to Fort Drum within like 5 hours, which was the plan. Not happening. And again, all of us, even at my level, had made that assumption, and that was the case. We got into these vehicles, again, Humvees. We did have some Humvees. We had, again, what we called cut Vs, or like pickup trucks, and we all piled at 5 tons, deuce and a half. So we filed into all of these things and started driving up I-90 in New York, and up 81, which is north of Syracuse, into Fort Drum. And, I can't recall how many vehicles fell out. I mean, tires blowing, axles breaking. We had to bring the Hemet up. It just, what a mess. I think it took us like 9 or 10 hours to get everybody up to Drum. And in one piece, everyone was safe. We were never unsafe at any point. It just, we were just like this ragtag unit that was like, okay, well, we're going to take this stuff and we're going to Iraq. Well, I don't even know if we're going to get to Drum, let alone get ourselves to Baghdad. But anyways, we made it, and it started our 8 months up there, which was a long time. It was really nice when we pulled out, literally pulled out of the armory in Troy. Our families were there, the news was there, all of the, it's a long residential road that the armory is on the end of. And so you have to drive down this long residential road to get back to the main road and get out to the highway where you're going. And all the people that lived on the residential road kind of lined up alongside of the road and had flags and stuff. And it was really nice. Aside from your political beliefs and whether you think these Guard soldiers should have been in Iraq or not, this is a big deal from a news/military news perspective, right? There's National Guard divisions going overseas. It hasn't happened since Korea. And, a lot of us are just a bunch of kids that just joined, been in for a few years, had no idea we'd ever go anywhere. And so these families that lived along this residential road were just nice, and they were just supportive. And again, they put their politics aside and were just like, listen, we're going to support these men and women as they get ready to put themselves in harm's way. So it was really cool. And it was interesting. I didn't know at the time, but there was a picture of me taken from the local news, the main news, the newspaper, the Times-Union, which covers the Capital District. And again, I didn't know that the picture was caught when I was there. And I happened to be saying goodbye to my first wife. I was married once when I was much younger, prior to my current marriage. And that's a whole different story. But anyways, I just happened to be married to my first wife when I was getting ready for this deployment. And I was saying goodbye, and they caught what they felt was a nice picture. I was looking at her, she was looking at me, whatever. Whatever. They really liked it, and they put it in the paper, and they wanted to do a story on the individual that was in that picture 10 years after the war. So this was 2015, 2014, 2015, obviously 10 years after we left. And they weren't able to record who the person was in the picture when they took it. And so they wanted to do the story, and so they reached out to the National Guard, and they're like, hey, who is this guy that's in this picture? We would like to interview him and ask him, what's he's doing with his life, and, is he still around? Like, what's going on with his story, so we could do a 10-year update. And so the Times-Union ended up getting a hold of the National Guard, the New York National Guard leadership, and they got a hold of me, and I ended up talking to them. But the funny part was the editor that I was talking to said, you're not going to believe it, but we have this picture up in the Times-Union building here in Albany. It's framed, and it's right next to the bathroom. And so we had no idea for 10 years who you actually were, but we just liked the picture, so we put it up in the newsroom, and it's right next to the bathroom. So like every time someone comes into the Times-Union, they walk past this picture, they have no idea what it is. We're like, oh, that's nice, but all right, now I'm going to go to the bathroom and come back. So he's like, you are the most looked at picture in all of this newspaper that this newspaper's ever had, because it just happens to be right next to the bathroom. And I'm like, well, that's nice. I don't know if there's a correlation there, but nonetheless. So anyways, it was really nice. And, we got to our trucks, and we made it up to Fort Drum. And, I remember pulling in and them showing us, the leaders showing us, again, I was just a young sergeant at the time, right? So, the senior NCOs and the officers getting ready to show us where we were going to live. And we were going into the old World War II barracks. So on the older section of Fort Drum. So for those of you who have been, I'm sure not many of you, but there's like a new post and an old post in Drum. And we were on Old Post, shocker, and they had old World War II era barracks that some were kind of revitalized, some weren't. Some were kind of, in the sense they like put down some old linoleum and whatever, but they gave us these barracks because they had the 10th Mountain Division, which is the command of Fort Drum, the post. They were obviously just told by Headquarters Department of the Army, hey, you're going to get this National Guard Division headquarters coming up. They're going to Iraq. They have nowhere to go. They're a guard unit. So, you got to put them on Old Post and figure it out. So 10th Mountain Command was like, all right, well, I guess we'll fix up some of these old World War II barracks and we'll get them squared away for these young soldiers. And it sucked. I mean, let's just be honest. We ended up living in these things for 8 months. We're going to combat, and you're going to say things like, hey, you're going to end up getting shot at and living in a foxhole somewhere. Yeah, of course. But yeah, do you want like a decent barracks like the rest of the soldiers at Fort Drum before you get ready to go to Iraq for your first deployment as a guard soldier? Yeah, but no, we ended up in these awful barracks. Some of them were like condemned, and then they had to fix them and make sure that they weren't condemned again. It just sucked. But so we lived in this two dudes in a room, and the shower was like, oh, I just had so much mold. It was awful. I got pictures of it, just disgusting. But so we lived there for 8 months. We did all of our training out of there. Every day we'd wake up for formation, we would do PT, and then we would head off to whatever training it was that we had to do. And, a lot of it was, we did marksmanship stuff. We did convoy training. So we were preparing to protect ourselves against IEDs, which was clearly in 2004, 2005, the main threat. It was the main threat really for the entirety of the war. But so IED training, and we did medical training, and we did training that was very specific to our MOS, so to our job duties. So we, myself and my colleagues, did intel specific training, and then the logistics folks, they did logi training, and on and on and on and on. Some of them again were like specific to our jobs, and then others were specific to combat in and of itself. And we were able to finish that training. Again, in the time that was allotted, we did it just as quickly and just as well as any of the other active duty divisions getting ready to go, but we weren't at 100%. So we ended up like sticking around for another 90 days. It was over 90 days before we got all of these backfills from active duty before we can go out the door. And so towards the end, in the latter half, the command, our local command, was trying to find things to do. They, obviously we're all there, we're on orders, we're getting ready to go, but, Big Army we checked that box in terms of all of the mandatory requirements. So leaders were doing what leaders do, and they're like, all right, well, let's keep training our soldiers and we'll find things that they can do. And, some of it was really, really good, and some of it was wacky, I would even say. I remember one time we were training how to identify anti-tank mines and anti-personnel mines in the volleyball pit, right? So there's this old Army tactic where you take like a really, really thin stick and you crawl along what you believe to be a minefield, and there's a certain way that you crawl, and there's a certain way you hold this stick, and you have to poke the stick into the sand or the dirt at, I don't remember, 3-inch intervals or something like this. And it's obnoxiously tedious and whatever, but it was an Army standard. And so they're like, all right, well, we'll do this, a couple of days. So we were literally in a volleyball pit. We had like a musician's, a conductor's wand. We were like stuffing that into the desert, into the sand pit of the volleyball pit to try to find mines we were never going to find in Iraq anyways. But, I guess it's just what leaders do to try to keep soldiers busy. And I remember another fun time. This was really fun for us. We had a young lieutenant who was interested in volunteering for training for soldiers, and trying to do the right thing as a young leader. And hey, how can I help soldiers train? And so he went to the battalion commander and said, hey, why don't we do some Arabic training? We'll gather all the soldiers at the end of the day, after dinner chow. So we go to dinner chow at 1800, 6 p.m. And then when we're done, 1930 or something, I'll gather all the Joes for an hour, and we'll put them in a big circle in a big formation, and we'll practice Arabic. And so we can pick up some words here and there for all of us that are going overseas. And the battalion commanders say, yeah, okay, it's not a bad idea. It keeps them busy, good training, blah, blah, blah. So I remember one night we ended up doing the training prior to dinner chow. I don't know why, doesn't matter, but we did it prior to dinner. And so we're out there, and the lieutenant's doing his thing, and we're learning these Arabic words, and the sergeant major, the command sergeant major of the battalion, now this guy, has been in the Army 100 years, right? This is his last deployment. I think he fought in the Civil War. He's here, and he calls out the LT at one point and says, hey, listen, points at his watch, and he's like, the Joe's got to go to chow. Chow's at 1800, 1830, whatever, and the chow hall's only open for a certain amount of time. So if your Joes don't get to chow by the time the chow hall's open, then Joes don't eat, right? And you got to feed the Joes. So Sergeant Major points at his watch, and the LT says, "Yes, Sergeant Major, I got it. Just a couple more minutes. Let me finish." And Sergeant Major just kind of nods and walks away. And, 5-10 minutes later, Sergeant Major comes back. We're still doing this. Sergeant Major comes back and he goes, "Hey, LT, let's wrap it up. We got to get out of here. The Joes have to eat. We got, chow hall time." And the LT looks at him and says, "At ease, Sergeant Major." Now he says this in front of the entire battalion. So we have, hundreds of soldiers that are out there, and most of us are all young, and junior NCOs or junior enlisted, and we just saw this first lieutenant who had been in the Army about 7 seconds tell a command sergeant major who, technically he outranks, but that's not the way the Army works, looks at a command sergeant major who's been in the Army since the Civil War and tells him to at ease. Not a good look. I remember just all of us standing there thinking like, I think that lieutenant just ended his life. I think that's the end of that lieutenant's existence. I didn't know what to say. So the sergeant major turned right around and he kind of gave him a nod and was like, okay. Walked in and then walked into the battalion commander's office, and needless to say, we were done with Arabic training at that point, and off the chow we went. And I won't pretend to know exactly what happened, but there were plenty of rumors that came out afterwards as to what happened to that lieutenant. And he remained in the unit, not in the way that he wanted, but he also learned a valuable life lesson in terms of what young officers, what their behavior should be like when dealing with senior command sergeants major. That's anyways, pretty shocking day. But these are just some of the things that we had to deal with when we were preparing to go to Iraq and waiting for the time to come when we would be ready to go. We did mount training, so it's military operations in urban terrain. Basically, the Army had built, with 10th Mountain, had built a large village out of like concrete structures with fake streets and that town houses and things like this. It didn't have power or anything, but it was just set up as like a village. And we went in there to train. I think we were there for 3 days or 4 days, and we had to sleep out at the mount site. And we did all of this training, kicking indoors and clearing rooms and dealing with, there were contractors there that spoke Arabic, and we were learning how to use translators to communicate with people, and, how to do, squad level tactics, walking through the streets if we were on patrol, and how to protect ourselves, and all this kind of stuff that was happening through the mount site. And so that, that ended up being really good training. And I shouldn't say none of us, but the vast majority of us didn't end up really doing that when we were overseas. Again, I was an intelligence sergeant, and so I spent most of my time working on computers and briefing commanders and studying, the insurgency. But I didn't do a lot of kicking indoors, let's put it that way. But again, just training that the Army wanted everyone to have, so there was a baseline understanding just in the event you ended up being in that position. We did have a little fun when we were there. I remember one event when we first got there. We were pretty much on lockdown, right? The leaders, none of us had deployed. The unit itself obviously was new. I had said last episode, I was like 10 years old or 15 years old or something at this point. And all the leaders, even though they were, majors and colonels, they hadn't deployed. And if they did, it was a long time ago on their active duty time during Desert Storm. It's just very different. And so they wanted to ensure that the discipline was there and that the soldiers were in the right mindset for combat. And so when we first got there, we were on complete lockdown. No civilian clothes. We were in uniform all of the time. If you weren't in your BDUs. We eventually got what we call DCU, so our desert camo. But these are the old BDUs that were, the green woodland with our black boots that we could shine and all that, which that doesn't exist anymore. But so, and if I weren't in our BDUs, then we were in our PTs, and couldn't drink, couldn't go off post, couldn't, and it was like we couldn't even go to the PX without signing out. I mean, they really were locking us down. I don't want to say like basic training but it really kind of locking us down in. And Fort Drum has an event called 10th Mountain Fest, and it happens every year around, if I remember, I think it's the 4th of July timeframe. And it's basically a big festival that the command leadership puts on for all of the members of the 10th Mountain Division who are up at Fort Drum, the thousands and thousands of them. And you can bring your families, and there's bounce houses and food and barbecues and booze, and everyone just goes up there and has a great time, and everyone mingles and whatever, right? And so we got up there in early mid-May, and we had been locked down weeks and weeks and weeks, and the commanders had finally decided, like, you know what, 10th Mountain Fest is coming. We might as well, open this thing up and give these kids, because again, a lot of us were like kids, give them some breathing room, and let's let them go to 10th Mountain Fest. They can wear civilian clothes. They got to be back at a certain time, and if they want to drink, they can drink, because none of them are driving. 10th Mountain Fest is right there on post, so we'll all just walk over to wherever it is, and I just remember that being a lot of fun. That was the first time we had an opportunity to kind of let loose and get together with our colleagues who we had been training with over the last 6, 7, 8 weeks. Some of them we knew because they were in our unit, but some of them were attached to our unit from other cities. Obviously, we had new soldiers coming in from active duty who had no idea who they were. And, this is the first time we could just kind of let loose, relax, figure out who these people were, start building friendships and, getting to trust each other. Something we knew we were going to have to do, getting us overseas, right? I mean, that's something that you really need to be able to have in order for you to get overseas and do well, is you have to be able to trust your battle buddy. And if you don't have times like that event that we had, and now that we ended up having more in the future, that was just the first one that the command let us participate in. If you don't have that, then you can't build that trust, and leadership struggles, and then you don't have unit cohesiveness. It's tough. So I remember that being a good time, but it did feel like it dragged on for a long time. 8 months is a long time to spend at Fort Drum, and it ended up being the reason that our deployment in total was like 18 months, when typically you're looking at 12 to 15. But because we had spent so much time at Drum, and that wasn't really the plan. The Army had thought that we would be backfilled to a certain extent in a certain amount of time, and it wouldn't take that long. And so we were supposed to be overseas, if I remember correctly, I think in November of 2004. I think it was in November of 2004. And again, we kept getting pushed back. And so, unfortunately, the 1st Infantry Division, who was the unit overseas waiting for us to get there, they kept being extended. So they would get notification from the Army that says, no, I know you guys were going to go home last week, but you've got 2 more weeks. The 42nd's not ready yet. You got to stick around. And I just remember that's sucking. Like we just wanted to get downrange, right? We just wanted to get there, get the mission started. All of our training was done, and our families are kind of being pulled one way or the other, or not one way or the other, but back and forth, because we would tell them, okay, November 30th, we're out the door. And then November 25th would come, and they go, well, no, we're not actually out the door until December 10th. Okay. All right. Well, then, and then the same thing with First ID downrange. They're telling their families, I'm not coming home until this day, but now it's this day. It kind of sucked. And it wasn't anybody's fault. It wasn't like the Army was doing something wrong. We just didn't get the people in as quickly as we thought we would. And so, and I remember one time it was the worst. We got pushed all the way back to the Christmas time frame, and we were allowed to go home for Christmas because, again, all these times kept getting pushed back. And so I ended up going back for the holidays, and it was like a double-edged sword. We were happy to go back for the holidays to be able to see our family, and it was something right up against Christmas. I think we were able to spend time for Christmas, but we weren't going to be able to be home for New Year's. And so I think we were released, let me just say December 22nd or something like that. And then they said, you got to be back December 26th or December 27th or something like that. And that's it. I mean, we've been pushed back so many times. This is it. We're leaving December 27th. So we went home to see our families and the Christmas time frame. And, we're just in this mindset over the holidays, like, that's it. And I remember getting another call again. It was the day before we had to be back. And they're like, yep, the Army extended us again. You can stay home for your, and be with your families through your New Year's Day, but you have to be back on January 2nd. And I remember at this point, we all ran out of leave. Like we didn't have any more time because, we were taking days here and there that you earn 2.5 days a month. We were taking days here and there, but we ended up just running out. And I remember the command being able to write a memo or whatever they did that allowed us to stay on pass. I don't require what approval level that came from, probably the division commander, but just gave us a couple of free days off, really, where we didn't have to charge our what you'd call chargeable leave in order for us to stick around and stay home until the first or the second. And fortunately, at that point, that was the last one. It was the 2nd of January or the 3rd of January. That was when we were actually done and we really were going overseas. And we ended up getting on a C-17 and which is the second largest Air Force cargo plane that exists out of the sea, outside the C-5. And getting on the C-17 and off to Germany and away we go. So it was an interesting time, no doubt. It was an interesting 8 months. But we wanted to be part of the mission. We were excited to be selected as a National Guard division. We wanted to test our resolve, if you will. We wanted to prove that, we could be just as good as the active duty soldiers, that we could do the job just like anybody else. And, when the president calls and it was a legal mission, as we talked about in the beginning of the episode, right? There was UN resolutions and Congress had approved us to go to war. So, off we went. And, there's a lot to be learned. That's for sure. Okay. So thanks for joining me here in part 2 of my Iraq story, the Fort Drum and kind of the background explanation. Again, just giving another, just a summarization of what it is that was happening globally and why we ended up being, why the Guard ended up being chosen to go to Iraq and boy, what our time at Fort Drum was like. So thanks for joining me today. As always, you can always reach out to me at headlinesinhistory.com. Shoot me an email, John Malik at Headlines in History. You could find me on social, obviously here on YouTube, but you can also follow me on Instagram at Headlines in History. If you have any questions, you have any show suggestions, or you have any, comments about the show, just, shoot me an email and I'll certainly be in touch, or, throw me a comment online and I'm always watching and we'll get back to you as soon as I can for sure. Join me next week as we get into part 3. We'll talk about, getting overseas and what it was like to be in Iraq at the time, some of the responsibilities that I had, and a lot of the life lessons that I learned and really kind of transitioned in my life to being the professional that I am today. And I think what we'll probably do is I'll probably do 4 episodes. So we'll do Iraq, the bulk of Iraq next episode, and then we'll tie things up in part 4. And I think that'll be good. So thanks again for joining me this week. I really appreciate everybody sticking by. Hope you like the video aspect of the podcast this week, and I'll talk to everybody next week.